Hello, and welcome to Physical Absence, Enduring Presence, a talk on grief, loss, and psychedelics. My name is Ifetayo Harvey, and I'm the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. Today, I'm joined by my co-panelists, Abou Farman, Dr. Diana Quinn, and Oceana Sawyer. Our discussion will be 1 hour with 30 minutes for questions. The People of Color Psychedelic Collective is a volunteer-run organization that seeks to educate our communities on the hallucinogenic effects and entheogenic properties. They have been used for centuries around the world. Through colonization and the war on drugs, psychedelics became criminalized and stigmatized. I came into this work 8 years ago as the daughter of a formerly incarcerated drug seller and deportee. My story of growing up with a parent in prison is one of the many examples of how the war on drugs destroys relationships, families, communities, particularly communities of color. When police kill Black people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Walter Scott, they use the war on drugs as justification. The war on drugs is the main culprit in skyrocketing arrests and prison population rates, and a major hindrance on research. Around the globe, psychedelics are a part of indigenous cultures, but because of colonization and whitewashing, whiteness remains the face of the so-called psychedelic revolution. But how can we have a psychedelic revolution if we don't atone for the harms caused by colonization and its extension, the war on drugs? We must first grieve. The word grief is defined as deep and poignant distress caused by bereavement. I believe that psychedelics are a tool for healing, grieving, and reimagining. So next, I want to call on my co-panelists. Tell the audience who you are and why grief and psychedelics.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Ife, and of the panel. We'll say it that way. So my name is Oceana Sawyer, and I am an end-of-life doula that's pretty much focused right now on the grief space. And I have taught over the past year. I've taught or presented a lot of courses related to grief, embodied grieving, ancestral recovery of ancestral trauma. And right now, actually, I am a participant, a student in a somatic abolitionism program, where I'm basically looking at what is the intersection of embodied grieving, which is what has been my focus this past year or more, what's the intersection of embodied grieving and somatic abolition? And so, because what my experience has been with myself and others is that grief is actually a really nice doorway, a useful doorway into uncovering or excavating our racialized trauma. The two are kind of married in a way for people in Black and brown bodies, Indigenous people to North Americas and in South Americas, and people of Asian descent. So that's just what is true and real for us. And so why not use grief as a doorway to working on excavating those pieces of trauma within the body and the psyche and the world, the world actually. Now, mostly how I do that is I am holding space for that conversation in my Patreon forum. And I also do that in my weekly Death Cafes, which is a huge, wonderful, yummy space. If any of y'all are bodies of color, culture, that has been a conversation that's just been growing for almost a year now and deepening in how grief and race, the body, all of that experience intersect. Now, for me personally, I do not have any professional direct experience with psychedelics. I do have students and a client who have talked about how the use of psychedelics has eased their fear around death. And certainly this is a conversation we've had in the Death Cafe, um, which is actually a good place for people to address their fear around death. And people have offered that psychedelics have been useful in exploring those fears. And I have had clients talk about, or a client talk about how effective psilocybin was in easing their transition out of their body. They were able to reduce their levels of pain killers, morphine that's administered at the end of life, dramatically with the use of those. So I've long been a fan, both in my own personal life, and I can see the application for the end of life process is really clear for me, at least in my anecdotal experience. So I'm really happy to be here, to be in these conversations with old friends and new friends, and I'm just excited to see where this goes.
Thank you.
Jump in next. Thank you, Oceana and Ife. My name is Diana Quinn. I am joining you here today from Anishinaabe territory, also known as Detroit, Michigan. And I am a licensed naturopathic doctor and a healing justice practitioner and end-of-life doula, and currently in training to as a psychedelic assisted therapist through the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I find that this conversation about the intersection of grief, loss, and psychedelics sort of weaves together a lot of threads of many spheres of interest and work that I've been doing in my career professionally, as well as for myself personally, and the trajectory that I've been on since really I was very young, as a person who has always been interested and drawn to non-ordinary states of consciousness and an animistic worldview of the living planet and what is unseen that we feel and may recognize, but don't necessarily speak to in our common dominant culture. So I come to this field sort of by way of a background in cultural anthropology and having an interest in shamanistic cultures and the study of non-ordinary states of consciousness that can be achieved through a myriad of routes like drumming, chanting, dance, many different ceremonial practices that have been and continue to be practiced by traditional and indigenous cultures all over the planet. And also knowing that entheogenic plants and fungi, substances, have been used for millennia by human beings, also in cultures all over the globe, and continue to be. So that is kind of the background to my interest, and the intersection where I'm, coming now at this point, having spent the last 15 or so years of my clinical practice focusing on integrative mental health, is seeing the way in which the so-called psychedelic renaissance or second wave of psychedelic therapy is developing with great fervor and tremendous breakthrough medical research in the scientific world, with applications for everything from post-traumatic stress disorder to treatment-resistant depression and anxiety, but then also, of course, for distress related to terminal illness and end of life. So these are things that I'm very interested in, but I'm also bringing sort of a lens of how can we approach these medicines in a way that is grounded and respectful of the many traditions from which they hail, without being appropriative, without being extractive, without causing harm to our relatives around the world who are impacted by the awakening interest in some of these plant medicines. So that's some of the lens that I bring. And in the work that I'm doing as a healing justice practitioner, intersecting, working with BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as the Two-Spirit LGBT community. I myself identify as a queer Chicana, so I kind of move in these spaces. I have been working for many years with folks who are in marginalized identities, facilitating healing justice practice spaces, and working with a lens within the healing justice framework, which seeks to identify how to holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and bring collective practices that can help transform the consequences of oppression in our bodies, minds, and spirits. So these are kind of the threads that I'm weaving together, and currently holding spaces for people of color, as well as queer identified LGBTQ folks, to come together in psychedelic integration spaces, virtually, online, and talk about their experiences in a supportive, anti-oppressive container. So that's some of the work that I'm doing, and really pleased to be here and excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Diana. Abou?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited and humbled to be here with everybody. Ife, thank you for founding the group. POC in Psychedelics, so necessary, visionary in the true sense, not just in the narrow sense in these circles, and for organizing this also, and Oceana and Diana for doing everything that you're doing all the time for so long. I write about death and teach about death, and I come to psychedelics and death and thinking about its colonial histories and its current sort of racialized and sometimes violent unfolding, both through a academic interest, but also a personal interest. My wife and artistic partner Leonor Caraballo died of breast cancer 6 years ago now. And in that state of being terminal, which is, you know, in a way, a recent state of being for people, because it's a modern medical diagnosis, being terminal. You have X amount of time. It's statistically kind of determined. You have 2.5 years, then you have, you know, 6 months, and then you have. So these are like increments of the end of life that medicine puts on, and it changes the entire experience of dying, of relating to life, of thinking about the horizon and the word terminal itself as a final ending with nothing beyond it. Right? Those are the assumptions. And so being in that state, well, we were obviously both artistically and intellectually trying to kind of, and personally grappling with all of what that meant, and exploring, you know, avenues beyond it as well, and having the financial privilege of being able to do some of the exploration. And one of the places that we ended up in South America was in the Peruvian Amazon, with what is now already then, you know, the ayahuasca boom. And noticing, as you know, as we traveled there and sat there and worked there, the kind of fraught, messed up politics of those centers and what was going on down there, and, you know, the bubble of those so-called healing centers that ended up being so removed from, you know, under the kind of the bubble of healing and sort of culture, being removed from the politics of indigenous life, of Shipibo, Conibo life problems, of people that we did get involved with and we continue to work with. And so we can talk about some of that work later, but, you know, Leo has passed away, but continues to work with us, working with the Shipibo Conibo Center, which is a center that we founded, working on, you know, indigenous projects of autonomy, and being surprised and not surprised with the lack of traction, the lack of interest that kind of project generated in the so-called, you know, in the ayahuasca world, in all those people who were not just, you know, Westerners, not just white, but also a lot of South American elites, a lot of global elites who have this sort of expansive consciousness ideology, but end up not being all that committed to actual social, economic, political transformation on the ground. And so that has become an aspect, a large aspect of my life, and the way that these issues come into play for me. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you all. I mentioned earlier that, you know, through the war on drugs and colonization, the psychedelic revolution became whitewashed. So can you guys explain how psychedelic whitewashing, the war on drugs, you know, result in loss and hindered healing for communities of color? And then maybe even talk about how the grief and the violence that we experience as folks of color is politicized. Diana, you look like you have a lot to say.
There is so much in that question. I think, you know, the piece that I'll take on, because there's a lot to unpack there, but just, you know, the first part about the whitewashing of psychedelics and subsequent impact on communities of color, and how this intersects with the war on drugs and the disproportionate harm to Black and Brown people. So yeah, I mean, I think that for one thing, one of the framings that I repeatedly see in the psychedelic movement at large both in terms of the mainstream public perception, as well as, and I mean, like Michael Pollan's book, for example, which is quite popular. Many people have heard about it, How to Change Your Mind. And as well, you know, in academic settings, at most of the psychedelic conferences that I've attended by renowned scientists and clinical researchers in this field, there's a mythology about the timeline of psychedelics beginning in, you know, the really, you know, kind of like the 1960s with white men at Harvard, or, you know, maybe a little further back with Albert Hofmann in, you know, 1938. Synthesizing LSD. And there might be a nod or a mention to indigenous, you know, like we also recognize that there was, you know, for 5,000 years of use by indigenous people. But really what we care about is the, you know, white men and, you know, the subsequent lifting up of and erasure of, lifting up, you know, white men predominantly, erasure of women in the field, of people of color in the field, of indigenous people in the field. So that's just one example of many where there's harm and erasure. And really pretty extensive and deliberate co-opting of those traditions by mainstream science, by medicine, to the extent of, you know, even the history, for example, of psilocybin, which is currently on track to for FDA approval, which, you know, it's anticipated that within probably the next year or two, it's likely that psilocybin as well as MDMA will be approved for use in medical settings, you know, for therapy. Already psilocybin is legal in many cities that have, well, not legal, decriminalized, I should say. Cities and states like Oregon. There's also legislation in California to decriminalize psilocybin. Whilst simultaneously no recognition of or reparations for the extractive history of psilocybin perpetrated, you know, all the way back by Wasson, who, you know, went to Oaxaca and, you know, met with Maria Sabina, was given a psilocybin ceremony, and then, you know, was asked not to make this information public, but subsequently published the information against, you know, her express wishes, resulting in desecration of, you know, that entire you know, village and community, and, you know, she was briefly jailed. I mean, it's like all of these impacts, right? So, and in the process, you know, Wasson and Albert Hofmann, well, Albert Hofmann as the chemist, synthesized a synthetic psilocybin, and fast forward, you know, a few decades to today, when, you know, Compass and probably 26 or so other corporate entities are seeking to get patents on psilocybin. So there's, you know, tremendous amount of wealth, you know, to be made in just the corporadelic side of, so-called, of this field, while there has, you know, yet to be any, you know, kind of recognition of, or, you know, reparations. And so that's just that's just one of so many examples that we could speak to.
Yeah, that there's so many examples, and nowadays we have more and more folks of color taking up space and creating their own spaces in the psychedelic world. And I was just talking to a friend about this the other day, how, you know, a lot of these white publications are still kind of using this narrative of like, oh, folks of color are left out of the psychedelic world, you know, it's that scarcity type of mindset. But I want to go back to the second part of the question on how has the war on drugs and colonization hindered our healing, has taken away like our healing rituals, ceremonies, and just, you know, our ability to grieve in general.
I'll say something on that. With the preamble that, you know, the war on drugs that reconfigured the carceral state that was built from the, you know, from the beginnings of slavery and then after emancipation, to keep Black folks in the U.S. subjugated, and then this kind of reinvention of it through the war on drugs and this massive incarceration that is, you know, unlike any other country. That war on drugs also has international dimensions also. And so when we talk about the war on drugs, we have to also think about it globally, not just in terms of its anti-blackness, but also in terms of the effects that it has had on Colombia that we're still seeing today. For example, the violence that we're seeing in Colombia, the state-led violence that can be traced back to American infusion of money against leftist socialist governments, or the threat of them, in Peru, in Colombia, elsewhere, right? Often under the guise of, you know, the war on drugs, right? Fighting cocaine and so on, right? And that's continuing, and it's continuing today. I'm more familiar with Peru where I'm working, but you know, the effects. Of course, we know that the cocaine consumption is American. You know, it's happening mostly in the U.S. The stuff is coming here, but and a lot of that violence ends up being displaced over there, and displaced in all kinds of ways. So now we're because of that, the American-led war on drugs, which militarized, which was also an excuse to militarize those countries, right? Those states, and therefore control populations that were rebelling. And that's always the case. We have to look at it always in terms of, you know, people who are trying to control the rebellions. And I'm going to get back to that in terms of the second part of it, which is on grief. But I just want to mention this. In the Amazon, what we're seeing now is that war on drugs that happened in the mountains in Peru, where the cocaine was being cultivated, because of the influx of sort of armed state-led and kind of paramilitary attacks in that area, it's all being flooded down into the Amazon. Right now, all the cocaine cultivation leads to deforestation, right? So it has all these repercussions, right? Including for the Shipibo Konibo people who are fighting that that incursion into their territories. Again, all of that is invisibilized, right? In most of like ayahuasca or global that discourse. In terms of the, you know, in terms of its relation, the relation of all of this, of the colonial and racist history of the war on drugs, but also its relation to the possibilities of healing, possibilities of mourning as healing, possibilities of dealing with both the killings and the dying, right? And all those rituals. I just want to say something quick. I think Oceana has a lot to talk about on this too. But I think, you know, part of the story, the mainstream story that we've gotten about death in this culture is that, you know, it's a death denying, fear of death kind of culture that, you know, that just doesn't want to look. And so, and whatever truth there is, and that's, you know, that's what's given rise to hospice, to palliative care, to death cafes, and to where we are now, reimagined, right? It's a reaction to that. Oh, we need to talk about that, and death positive movements, and all of that is fine. But I you know, I have a worry that it also eats up. I don't think in the spaces that Oceana is running, for example, but in general, it eats up other histories, right? And when I look at some of those histories, what I'm referring to is that, you know, other histories of dispossession, other histories of killing that are part of how, like you said, Ife, how we're given possibilities to mourn and to heal. And I see that across, you know, look at across the colonial lands, and what you see is consistently prohibitions placed historically, right, by colonial administrations on funerary rites and death rites and related practices. And those continued in the post-colonial, post-independence to some extent, right? And we're talking about from the Haitian Revolution onwards, in Jamaica and Zimbabwe, in India. I mean, wherever you look, you see a lot of that ban on those funerary rites happening. And so that in itself, I think, has an effect on what kind of the intersection of things we're talking about. You know, it makes me say that, in fact, what we should be looking at, that is not that there's a fear of death, but that there's a fear of the dead. Right, that is not some like psychological condition that humans have. That's a story, right? That we fear death, but there's a fear of the dead, and there's a reason for that, right? Partly it's because of a secular kind of ideology that holds its monopoly on its sense of reality, what's real, right? And of course, the dead aren't real in that vision. But it's also a fear of uprising, right? Because again, from the Haitian Revolution to George Floyd and BLM this last summer, right? Colonized people have rebelled often through gatherings around dead bodies, through funerals, right? Where the energy is there, where the rage is there, where the possibility of coming together in group is there. And so it's that band that in part, has shaped modern grief also. And I think we're not talking about that enough. And in the communities that are affected, there is not, in fact, that from Palestine today, right? All the shit that's going down there now. I mean, that's not death denial. There's a hyper awareness of death. I would say there's death hyper awareness in many communities, including in the U.S. Black communities in the U.S. Where dying is understood as and felt as a constant in life, as a constant possibility, right? And that there's a continuum, like we saw last summer, between getting killed and dying prematurely, in a system of medical apartheid, and racial inequalities based on resources and so on. And I think that's the sort of thing that I've seen more recently in the spaces that Diana was referring to and Ife was referring to, right? Of BIPOC spaces, where this then is kind of the starting point for a conversation, whereas in many other places, that those conditions and those histories are glossed over or erased or erased under kind of a universal talk about death. Okay, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
Brother, you just said so much stuff. You saw me writing. I was like, oh yeah, I want to jump on that. Oh, I want to jump on that. I could have interrupted you 5 times. Like, oh yeah.
Jump.
And I just want to say this whole death positive thing, please. I'm just so over it. Just so over it. My voice, you can hear this tremor in my voice because I'm so mad and so sad all at the same time. Because just like what Brother Abou was saying, when this fear of death, this is a white thing. Okay, this is what, in a way, you can see, and you did such a great job of weaving this together. But these sort of fears, you can feel them rooted in colonization. How are we in our white European bodies going to go on in the face of all this resilient Black and brownness? Good God, we got to do something about this. We got to tamp those people down. So, and it's can I swear on this? Because I just want to say that's bullshit. I mean, all that white fragility stuff, oh God, don't get me started. But what I want to say about this is that the point around the fear of death, specifically being something in my experience, just sort of looking at this conversation around death and dying, is actually a very particular thing to who I see people in white bodies, because people in Black and brown bodies, as Abou said, this is like a lived, this is our experience. It's happening all around us. Not only is it happening to us and around us, but the fear, the lived fear that our very own bodies are just a step away. Just one hair, just one statement by one white person, one breath away from being our death. It's so close. You have no idea how close it is felt and lived daily by people in Black and brown bodies. So this notion of fear of death is sort of like, how could you be afraid at the level that I'm hearing the conversation, in the mainstream about fear of dying? That's like, because the other thing about death in at least the Black community is, and I'm sure this is true in other communities of color, but there's no individual notion of death. We talk about complicated grief or compound grief, and most people hardly even know, white people in white bodies even know how to talk about that. Like, what is that? And God, you got to define it for them. But that's actually our lived experience. Individuals do not die in Black community, in African descended community, in Indigenous community. Individuals do not die. People die. Family is having a death. A people is having a death. And so when someone like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery die, we are all grieving. That is not an individual. That is our brothers, that is our sisters. And so to create space within our communities, when I say our, you know who I'm talking about, to create space in our communities for actual grieving is not only, it's not only critical to healing and building resilience in our communities, which already, I will say, are steeped in that, but it's also a way to acknowledge what's real. Honestly, I think every Black person should have had a week off at least after George Floyd. I'm just going to say as a one example. Now, here's why we don't get a week off. Because if they gave us a week off every time they shot one of us, we wouldn't be working. It's just crazy. So, and that's fine too. Don't get me started again on white supremacist capitalism. Okay, it's a whole nother thing. But I will say in that regard that this whole thing around death and grieving and how there's not space for that I'm going to talk about us. For us in this culture is because that is where the catharsis happens. That possibility, that space to metabolize death and loss and have that to be transformed into fuel for actually really living creativity. That's the thing they're afraid of. And that's actually right. That if your goal is to keep us numb, mechanistic cogs in the capitalist wheel, then that's actually effective. And that's one of the things I want to say about this is that this way that we have of talking about death like it's some kind of foreign, scary thing, that's not an accident. That's intentional. That's intentional, because if we really were acknowledged and given the time, just like I was just talking about this morning, actually in a podcast, that, one of the few safe spaces that we get to actually have our grief, at least people in Black bodies, is in church. It's at that funeral. That is a full on, loud, messy, emotional, body centered, moving, grieving process. It's life. It's life recognizing death. And but we get that. What do we get of that? A couple hours, few hours, maybe a day. And then I've done, I know this because I've done all the research on this whole year. I've been looking at grief and the Black experience. And all the studies talk about how Black folks saying, I got that moment in church, and then it was back to the grindstone. Got to keep on keeping on. And there are lots of reasons for that, you know, economic, social, survival, condition, whatever, lots of reasons. But that few moments it's just, it's like, it's good, it's a beginning. But imagine what's possible if we all get space to actually grieve. Yeah. So I know there's a lot more I wanted to say in response to what both of you guys have shared, Diana and Abou, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we definitely lack, the spaces to properly grieve, and as a culture, we don't really respect that process of grieving enough. I wanted to pivot a little bit over to the psychedelic side of things, because I know that there's a lot of psychedelic research happening in general. And I first came into psychedelics when, I was at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference in 2013. And there's a panel talking about end of life care, palliative care, and using psychedelics. I know there's been a few studies sponsored by NYU, UCLA, Johns Hopkins on the effects of psychedelics for people who are dying of terminal illnesses. So I think the general claim is that, psychedelics can make death more meaningful. So I'm wondering, what are y'all's thoughts on this? And as it relates to folks of color, everything that we just talked about, the lack of space, the level of violence that we face on the day-to-day, what issues come up for us when we're talking about, researching, dying on psychedelics, and just, also folks of color being involved in the more general psychedelic research.
I can speak to this. So the studies that you are mentioning, which are really powerful, just really remarkable outcomes in terms of how profoundly these substances and these particular studies are looking at psilocybin, psychedelic mushrooms, in patients with terminal illness, and the profound way in which they significantly decreased death anxiety, that they decreased depression and hopelessness and despair, the significance with which they increased quality of life and acceptance of death, and really just transformed, the whole situation for the participants. It really is powerful. I mean, the statistics and the outcomes in these studies are really unparalleled with anything else that, conventional medicine has right now. I mean, no antidepressant and no other form of treatment is as effective as, a single high dose experience, or I think in the research they had two experiences, two psychedelic journeys combined with psychedelic assisted therapy for these patients. So in that sense, it's really profound. And also the fact is that all of these studies had over 90% of the participants were white. They had very few participants of color. And this is pretty emblematic of most of the research in psychedelics across the board, whether, the target population is treatment-resistant depression or PTSD, ranging probably from 90 to 96% study participants are white. And a large part of the reason why that is is that, well, there's lots of reasons, but one significant reason is that most of the therapists and clinicians that do this work are white. There are very few people of color who are trained as of yet. I mean, that's changing. We're, trying to, bring about a change in that as trained as psychedelic therapists. And, there's also just, this is the larger context, which is that, there's just a smaller percentage of Black and Brown clinicians in general, like I think a tremendously small percentage of psychotherapists and other, kind of health providers, for example, are of color. Due to disparities in generational wealth and access to education and the racism embedded in higher institutions of learning, and for many other reasons. So there are lots of gaps that contribute to disparities in access, just in terms of people of color receiving this care, period, or being included in research. We don't know actually how these medicines specifically are, helpful, and in what way, the care might need to be different, for people of color, because that research doesn't exist, so that's, one large piece. And then there's this other piece, which is that all of the medicalization of psychedelics in the framing that it's being used as psychedelic assisted therapy for terminal illness at end of life, in depression, anxiety, and so forth, is all couched inside of the medical industrial complex, which is, of course, deeply embedded with racism and structural harm, right? And, long legacies of and continued violence against people of color, particularly Black folks. And when I think we're talking about research, there are good reasons, not to be, trusting or to be wary of, kind of entering into medical research. So, for Black and Brown folks. So those are some of the ways in which there's, at one hand, kind of from like a neoliberal perspective, like promising new, medicine, but yet all of the same problems still exist. And, this hasn't addressed them in any way, right? And there's the same disparities still exist, and if anything are deepening, right? So that's I could go on, there's a lot more. I mean, I think just even in terms of the way that, the medical model has now become, has positioned itself as the expert, and has really, kind of taken away the knowledge from traditional keepers of these traditions, or of these plant medicine traditions. Now, like the medical model really kind of prioritizes and lifts up, kind of licensed and trained medical providers, and disenfranchises traditional practitioners, and, contributes to the epistemicide of, kind of prioritizing one way of knowing, and, kind of construction of knowledge over another. So I'll stop, give someone else a chance to speak.
Well, yeah, I just want to emphasize the last point, which I think is really important, that Diana made, because, I mean, you kind of see over the last few years, as people, some activists, sometimes some well-meaning NGOs and so on, have pushed back and kept pointing to, traditional practitioners, historical use, and issues of representation in conferences and so on and so forth. So you see the slow inclusion, I would say maybe over the last 5 or 6 years, of an indigenous perspective, sometimes an indigenous figure, in psychedelic conferences, right? Global ones, American ones, etc. Even in the research, when you read them, the more recent publications always indicate and acknowledge sort of the indigenous roots. But this representational politics, whatever, because at the end of the day, what Diana is saying is going to happen, which is medicalization right, is just going to have a monopoly on expertise and the legal administration of it, right? So, and that requires training, that requires money, that requires all kinds of things that traditional users, traditional experts, who are experts, uh, don't have access to in that world. That's not being talked about, right, Diana? There's another piece of it that sort of makes me go back to something that Oceana said, which is, in some contexts, individuals do not. It's not individuals that die, right? It's groups, it's people, and I think there's a very different notion of healing with psychedelics, including healing after death, including mourning, right? At least in the communities that I've been involved in, which is that you're not treating a person, right? There are many ways in which that's sort of interpreted and understood, but you're healing a social condition, right? That's not present at all, right, in the current sort of approach to psychedelic therapy. Whereas in fact it's the central way in which Shipibo practitioners, not vis-a-vis Westerners, right, because they're smart enough to know who they're treating and who expects what, right? But within Shipibo communities, it's always about dealing with the social relation as part of the illness, as the key part of the illness, right? Not just my liver, which at this point does need quite a lot of care, I think. But so, and I think that approach is I think something that we have to build up and we have to hold on to. That's outside of sort of the medical authority. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad y'all brought up the issues around the medical model. One of my colleagues, Cassandra Frederick, she said it best, that the medical industry is an extension of the carceral system, right? Because there's a history there of Black folks, brown folks, folks of color being criminalized. I think right now in New York, they're still drug testing women while they're in labor, and you could get your kid taken away from you if you test positive for something like cannabis, right? So that speaks volumes about medicalization and how criminalization is very much so tied into that.
I think that this whole intersection of medicalization and criminalization is probably the crux at why it makes these alternative treatments inaccessible to Black and brown people. In addition to, I mean, when you guys talk about how, and I've heard this from a few people around how ketamine now, there's some psychedelic treatments that are becoming available for people in terms of grief and end of life. And I hear that and I think, well, that's nice. I hope all those people enjoy it. I can't. It's hard for me to imagine how to introduce that or work with that substance, even legally, with a Black person because of the context. I mean, forget about who is administering this to Black people. It's all, as Diana pointed out, more than likely going to be a white person, and so the trust level there is already like makes that a huge barrier for real. But beyond that, what I've seen and have read about is, this sort of response that is inherent now in Black people around anything that's not mainstream medical. You can get in trouble for that. If anybody's going to get arrested for this experimental treatment, you know who it's going to be. So I don't even want to go there. And yet, you know, this is something I was going to mention earlier. Got inspired by something Abou said around, you know, in Africa, there exists alongside Christianity and Muslim traditions and even the medical establishment, there is a thriving indigenous medical healing community. These things happen side by side. You know, in Western Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa, people are given iboga or ibogaine to treat certain, you know, disorders. I wouldn't even, and that word disorder is not even a real word, you know, there. It's like, I got something going on. I would like it to be different. Okay, here, try this. You know, the person, the healer gives you something to have it be different. And it's not necessarily like a disease or a disorder. It's just, this is not, I'm not functioning the way I'd like to be functioning. Could I get something to support me in functioning the way I want to be? So that all happens, you know, in Africa. But that has been stripped from us here. We don't even know how, we can barely access our third generation names of our people. And this is another reason why I think this conversation around psychedelics, and I love the way you said, I keep forgetting this phrase, but I like you brought it up, Diana, non-ordinary states of consciousness are, I think they're just so important, because the ordinary state of consciousness for Black folks is, you know, we see what that is, and enough said there. But the possibilities that exist in non-ordinary states of consciousness, which I just want to name, already happens on Sunday morning. You know, that music, that motion, that's all a trip. We all going on a trip to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land together. That's real. And that is also intentional. Okay, that's intentional by us. That's intentional medicine on our part. It's what's been given us. It's sanctioned. It's safe. And so what I would like to propose right here to my brothers and sisters, there's more stuff we could be using to liberate our consciousness, to liberate our healing, to liberate our lives. And these tools, these plant medicines, whether they're indigenous to South America or Africa or North America, you know, given appropriate acknowledgement, reverence, honor, can be used to further our goals of not only healthy living and dying, on the spectrum of living and dying too, I just want to say, that's another construct that is, and this is another construct, just like race. You be living all the way up until you are not in your physical body, and then you be living in some other plane. That's my point of view. I'll just say that, which is another reason why these support tools that are available in the plant medicines are absolutely supportive of anybody holding those points of view, and there are many of us that do. So I think I lost what the other point I was going to make, but thank you for that. I think I got that point across.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I agree. There are so many tools out there that we could be using to help us process and grieve and heal. And I love that you brought up the church, because I'm from South Carolina. So my mom always told me about people catching the Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit in church, and or speaking in tongues and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely non-ordinary states of consciousness there. I wanted to kind of pivot into our imaginations, our individual or collective imaginations, and talk about, the work that y'all are doing as individuals. How do you envision, the work around loss, grief in our communities with psychedelics? What are some things you're seeing now? What are some things you like to see in the future around this topic?
I can start us off on this one. I just really want to speak to, something that Oceana said, which was about, the way that as people of color, the harms that we experience don't happen to us individually, that they happen to us collectively in community. And so too must our healing be in community, I feel. And, I think your example of the church is, like a prime example of this. And my experiences being honored to sit in ceremony with Indigenous community. This is how healing in medicine is done, right? In those settings as well. Like for Black and Brown people, these medicines come from our traditions, and in many cases, because of colonization, because of the war on drugs, they were taken. Maybe not from our own specific unique, culture, or, where we specifically, are from in our lineage, but collectively, for people of color, this is the case. And, I see a reclamation and reinvention of community care contexts with entheogen assisted, communal space, and community care in the framework of psychedelic integration spaces, community healing spaces. This is kind of this is the focus of the work that I'm doing. And I see it as both a reclamation and a imaginative, like, reinvention of how we can move forward in a good way, like in right relationship with these medicines, and get our healing, do our grieving, transition, forward in, kind of a more liberated way. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that I want to just piggyback on what you said, Diana, about community, that this healing and grieving and mourning happening in community is really the way forward. And as you were talking, I really felt this idea that has been emerging for me in this conversation, which is, I think this is the way that we're going to, at least in the Black community, have access to these other tools. It's not going to be individuals going to therapists, because we know how that is. And it's certainly not going to be individuals getting anything from their doctors. It's going to happen in community. And so I'm really just underscoring this idea that, to the extent that we can create communities of color to have access around healing, is the extent that I think we have all of these other, we can make use of these tools. And if anything, I see a way forward is to create more community. And I've been looking at that for a while. It's just, just more groups, more places, virtual and live, for us to gather and have these conversations. And I think it'll be fractal, it'll just ripple out.
It'll be psychedelic.
Yeah, I have a couple of things that I've jotted down that I want to say about this is, first of all, I think that activism is healing, or at least is part of healing. It can also be exhausting and sometimes damaging and internal fight, all of that stuff. But I think it's an important part of everything we've talked about in a way, right? And I think that healing may be also, in this sense, sometimes too soft a word for what's required. It's an important what we're all trying to do, but there's this certain softness in it, that I think may need to be pushed a little bit. Of course, I think historically it's been hard enough to bring healing into sort of political activist circles because of a kind of a leftist history, and so on. I think, so that's one piece of it. Another piece with the psychedelics is that I think, they create a possibility of, for me, right? It's also just one place, not the only place where I have an ongoing connection with the dead, with my dead, which I think is important to maintain, to cultivate, right? And it's a sensory relation as well as a kind of a mental one and so on. And the third one is, going back to something Oceana said around to metabolize, in a way, I don't know if you use the word mourning, but I think that's what you were referring to metabolize loss into a living creativity, right? And I think that's kind of what, I mean, and of course, every sort of our current setting is different from settings of the past. And so we have to always be creative in our mourning to meet the context, the current contemporary context. And I think, my part of what I've been more and more thinking about and trying to also enact has been, to create rituals, collective, right? That allow for coming together, mourning. And I'm gonna plug. I don't know who's out there in the audience. First of all, I have no idea who is there and so on. And I don't know if our texts go out there. Like if I put something in the chat, do people see it? I have no idea. But yeah.
If you put it in the chat, I can post it for the audience.
Oh, okay. They don't necessarily. Okay. So this is something, I'm sorry for the shameless plug, but this is something we're actually doing on Sunday as an example of a kind of, as a small collective mourning work that's also political mourning and what I call critical mourning work, right? So if people want to join in that, you're welcome. But I think that's sort of, we're all doing something in that realm. And then I'll put another plug because in Shipibo land in the Amazon, there's a union. It was a union of healers, a union of expert of Onanias that was formed a few years ago that we've been working with, who have been you can find them on this site, but who have been working, especially after the pandemic, which has been very hard on the communities in the Ucayali region where they are, to both, to get a diagnostic, and they're thinking very holistically again about this in terms of, it's not just the pandemic, it's all the other conditions around it that's causing the devastation, but also putting together what they call a protocol for both physical, but also energetic and spiritual healing, right, in those communities. So anybody who might be interested in also contributing to their effort can get in touch with through the link that I put out there.
Thank you for that. I got a few questions from our audience that I wanted to see if you guys could address. There's two of them. I think this one is for you, Oceana. Can you elaborate on the practice of somatic abolition And then another question I got was, this person would love to hear about any rituals or practices folks themselves have used to find peace or softness around grief as it relates to psychedelics.
So, two things. First of all, I just want to say that I just want to acknowledge that a couple of times I spoke about the Black community as if it's a monolith. And I just want to maybe back that up a little bit and say that I don't speak for the entire community. And I don't even know that I could speak to the entire community. But I can only speak from my own experience and research. So I just want to acknowledge that. And somatic abolitionism is basically a way to, a process for looking at how racialized trauma has lives in the body, how it affects the body and the lives of people, all people, white, Black, brown people, and how the process of metabolizing that racialized trauma can lead to liberation for all people. In particular, in the context of obviously Black and brown people getting some space in their bodies and nervous systems to actually not be in response to oppression, but to actually move into the realm of generativity and creativity around how it is we could just be living our lives and not in response. So that's one piece. And then in terms of people with white bodies, the possibility there is to gain resilience in the conversation around abolitionism or liberal liberation for people who are not. So that is what's available in some, so it's a body-based process for looking at basically social justice. Whatever that means. I'm developing a very interesting relationship to justice these days. So I'm honestly, just personally for me, way more interested in the personal liberation of just myself and my people. And y'all can work out the justice. I believe people should do that, please. Where I'm standing in the conversation is all around liberation. And I will leave it to my colleagues to discuss the rituals for as it relates to psychedelics.
Yeah, so I also want to just add in this last question we got. Someone asked for suggestions on using psilocybin to move through grief. Similar to the other question, if folks want to talk about rituals or practices that folks have used to find softness or peace around grief as it relates to psychedelics.
So I can speak very generally to that without, saying anything that's kind of prescriptive about how, to proceed. But I think that, there's sort of two components a little bit because, ritual obviously can be practiced independently from any kind of mind altering substance. So, building in ritual practices to move with grief, to commune with loved ones that have passed, to cultivate an ancestral practice. I think all of those things are, I would highly, recommend, and they're very unique and kind of personal. So it's difficult to, kind of share something that's really kind of one size fits all. But you know, and I generally, you know, when I'm working with folks individually, kind of start with where they're at, like what their cultural lineage is, like what their context or framework is, because that often will be most useful when, you know, kind of developing ritual practices or ceremonial practices, for example, to work with grief or anything else for that matter. I mean, you know, I can share, you know, my own practice and experience, particularly as it pertains to ancestral grief and like historical grief, and the ways in which plant medicine has really both deepened my awareness of my ancestral memory, and also reawakened a lot of ancestral grief that I didn't know was there. This is a lot of the stuff that, you know, Oceana is kind of speaking to with, you know, the somatic practice. So so yeah, I mean, that's a very, I don't know how helpful that is. I mean, I think, you know, developing a spiritual practice or a ritual practice as a foundation, and then having a lot of good support, community support, and other, you know, sources of support, especially if someone's, you know, kind of exploring working with psilocybin or other plant medicines, I would highly recommend. And also just acknowledging that there are certain instances where they would be contraindicated for folks. I think it's important to say that. You know, there are medications that interact with these substances. So it's really crucial that for folks that are taking antidepressants or other psychoactive medications, that, you know, check with your practitioner, because most of them are contraindicated, you know, for use. And certain medical conditions like cardiac conditions, or certain psychiatric conditions where people might be at risk of experiencing things that the medical establishment calls psychosis, would be not a good candidate. So I just want to mention, you know, they're not necessarily for everyone, but if someone's exploring either full dose or micro doses of psilocybin, I would, you know, connect with someone who is experienced, and you know, kind of connect with either individual support or community support to help you with both the, you know, ritual and ceremony for grief, as well as integration of your experience, because that's really the crucial part, is how you work with the experience after the fact.
Yeah, thank you. Did other folks want to take a stab at that question, or did y'all want to move on to some other questions from the audience? Okay, I'll read a few of the questions out. One person wants to know if anyone on the panel has been present when psychedelics have been used to engage with death anxiety in people with terminal illnesses, and they want to just hear more about what that process looks like. And another question was, what thoughts do y'all have on the way the pandemic and last year's uprisings may have changed the way we experience grief and loss?
Wow. Yeah, maybe different questions. I'm just sorry. I wanted to pick up on also what Diana was saying, but I ended up getting lost in reading all the questions on the side.
Yeah,
But
go ahead.
but it's related to that first one also, which is, you know, I think first of all, you know, there are guides in different communities, and I think people who want to use that should seek out those people. Obviously, you know, there are all kinds of issues about it being out and public facing and so on, but people can be found. I think it's, like Diana said, important to work with someone, at least to begin with. It was for me, and I've also been in other situations with others who've gone through that. And I think, part of what, a lot of like, again, going back to previous part of the discussion, a lot of what the research on this stuff says is that the anxiety is relieved, right, by people feeling a certain kind of dissolution of themselves into a larger universal something, right? I suppose those are people who didn't feel that sense of connection to the universe to begin with. Some might already start there, but I think what I want to say, both out of my experience and conversations with others I've been with, is something I said earlier, which is which is actually establishing a connection with the dead. All my secular empiricist colleagues would jump down my throat and withdraw or deny my tenure application and so on at this point. But I think that's part of what it is, and in that process of connection, there's a lot of release. And I think, again, Diana's right not to be prescriptive, but I will be on some level, and I think we talked a lot about grief, but not its physicality. Loss is really physical. It's like on a molecular level, it's felt, right? Of a connection. And I think crying is part of what's important with psychedelics as well. Right. So again, there's this image of psychedelics as having, all these visions, but it's really a deeply emotional. Emotion lives in you, it's a very deep experience that should release all kinds of things, including lots of tears and sweat from the body. And I think those are all part of, and it's not, again, I think, a lot of this research says, oh, you need one dose and it's done. And of course, this is for people at the end of life. So, they have usually 6 months diagnosed to live. Those with grief after loss are people who survive and have to go on into the future carrying. But I think psychedelics help us carry, not as a burden, but carry with us our dead into the future. And I think, the ongoing cultivation of crying for me has been part of that connection and that carrying forth, that carrying forward. And I prescribe it. No,
Yes, more crying for everyone. Yeah, I think that this last question is interesting, in terms of like how has the pandemic and how has the uprisings changed the way we grieve and experience loss. I know that, Oceana, you were talking earlier about how for Black folks, death is like one word away. And I feel like that has been compounded with the pandemic, especially because it was like as soon as the news and public discourse saw that the pandemic was primarily impacting Black folks and folks of color, people started to care a lot less, right? And did I lie there? I mean, so at the same time, I kind of think about how we've had like over 500,000 deaths, and there's been a major lack of like public mourning or public grief. I know there was a project, I think it was Detroit, where folks took like these big portrait of folks and put them along the highway, which I thought was really cool. But Belle Isle. Oh, okay. Belle in Michigan. Okay. Yeah. So it feels like on one hand, a lot of these deaths are just being swept under the rug, right? Like we're not really grasping how massive how big it's been, when we compare it to like something like 9/11, where about 2,000 people died, and that day, we talked about that for years. There were bumper stickers, all this like patriotic propaganda going around. But with COVID, it's like, nothing has happened. So I'm also wondering that too. Will we take our grief and our mourning more seriously now, or is it just, are we gonna, open back up, go back to normal, and kind of just go about our business like usual?
I feel like because of the pandemic and all the reasons you said, who didn't see that? Like, wow, the studies come out and now it's like, you know what? Let's just go back to no mask and open it back up and we'll just let people continue dying. Yeah. What I see is that it's more available. It's actually easier now, at least in people among people of color, to talk about the need to grieve, what is happening to us, because of we've had the year plus of death disproportionately. That conversation just actually feels more available. Um, Now, the tools and the context for doing that are a different subject, but it, in my mind, we've definitely taken a step towards, yes, this is a real and valid conversation we could be having. So that opens it up in my mind to what can happen if attention is actually paid and focused on these conversations. So and you can hear it in the way that people talk about, I'm tired.
Mm-hmm.
All of that conversation around, I'm so tired.
Mm.
That's grief. And you can say that now and people hear it like, yeah, you're right. What is there to do about that? So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw on your panel a few weeks ago, Black Women in Grief, you uplifted the NAP ministry and talking about rest and how that's connected to grief. So I'm wondering, I guess, we're almost at time, given that you're saying, that folks will be able to talk about grief a bit more. When you combine that with psychedelics, how can this transform our communities? What is the point that we're trying to get to? Is it, is it just grieving, having that space to grieve? Is it liberation? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I wanted, there was an article in the Philadelphia Citizen last summer. That's very interesting, but one of the things it says that we need a mourner in chief, so I think part of it is, how do we, how do we mourn collectively, but how do we also mourn through, is there a kind of authority that needs to lead? It's a question, right? I don't know, but that when they presented that as an idea, like what's the role of authority and leadership in mourning?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely felt like during the pandemic, I felt like we needed, yeah, like a mourner in chief to kind of guide us through this whole process, right? Because it was like, I think Oceana, you said this earlier, that kind of whisper of death was like all around us, and it was amplified during the pandemic.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that the point of grieving, metabolizing grief, is liberation. That's all. It's liberation. It's being free. It's reclaiming our lives away from the mainstream capitalist machine that would grind us to dust, continues to grind us to dust. It's a reclamation. It's a revolutionary act. Yeah. You want to get free, you're gonna have to go through grief. That's just, yeah, I can say that definitively.
Yeah. And I think that part of what we're being tasked with is also metabolizing a lot of the historical trauma and unresolved grief from generations, that hasn't had necessarily the space or the, the time to, kind of rest and to grieve. So there's a lot. But I agree with you 100%, Oceana. That's it's liberatory, right? That's and it's for more joy, more pleasure, more power, more expansion, more living. That's the purpose.
I'm glad you delineated that historical context. And when you said that, I realized I just have it that way. That's just like embedded in the way I talk about grief. That it is both. It is the present and it's the historical. And in a way, that is how we be good stewards of the legacy of our families and our people who got us to here, who made all those sacrifices to get us to here and now. As you said, Diane, who didn't have the space and time. Well, guess what? I got that. I know plenty of people who got that, and more people who maybe don't think that they do, but if you look really a lot closer, you do. And so it is a good use of the genetic material, the life force you have been given to address the historical passed down grief, trauma that you have been given. It's not your duty, but it certainly could be your legacy to pay attention, to tend to care for that grief that has been passed on, so that what you pass on, even if you don't have kids, even if whatever it is you pass on to your family, extended family, is cleaner, sweeter, more joyful, more love filled. Yeah.
Yes, yes. That's such a wonderful note for us to end on. I want to thank you all for just bringing your insights, your knowledge, your presence to this discussion today. It was really, really powerful. Um, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. I hope that you continue to support our work, POC Psychedelic Collective. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. And our website's www.pocpsychedelics.com. So thank you guys so much for joining us on this beautiful Friday evening. And I hope you all really got something out of this conversation.